So this video is to help you understand your results a little bit better, since the CFA has now changed the way that they present your level 1 results. Typically, it used to just be a grid that looked like this, and there were 3 columns. One was less than 50%, the other one was 50 to 70%, and the other one was greater than 70%. And you'd have all the 10 sections listed here, and you'd get X's that look like this. So you basically just had an idea that you were greater than 70% on one topic, somewhere between 50 and 70 on another, but you weren't really quite sure where you stood in relation to everyone else. But that's basically what it looked like, and it's moved to this now. And there's a lot of information in here, so let's start with what we have up here. Well, actually, let's start with the bars. This solid white bar in the middle is the MPS, called the minimum passing score. And while they don't like to actually publish what the minimum passing score is, it's believed that it fluctuates anywhere from 67 to about 72%, depending on the year and the types of answers and the performance of the overall group, but somewhere in there. So most people just say, you know what, it's right around 70%. The dotted white line up there is the 90th percentile, which means that 10% of candidates scored above that line, and this down here represents the 10th percentile, which means that 10% of candidates scored at the bottom. So that's the bottom 10%, this is the top 10%, there's the middle 80%, and the blue box represents a confidence interval around your true score. So this solid line will represent your score based on a percentile. So you get to see where you are based on the 90th percentile versus the 10th percentile, and in relation, of course, to the minimum passing score. The minimum passing score, most people think, well, if that's 70%, that means 30% must have scored above this line. That's not true at all. So don't interpret that as meaning if this is roughly the minimum passing score and it's roughly 70%, that means 30% are above that line. That's not what that means at all. If that's the minimum passing score, everyone below here failed. This year the pass rate was 43%, so anything above this line is 43% of all candidates scored above that line, because you have to get above that line to pass. So it doesn't quite work out that way. So we can't interpret this as a 70%, as the 70th percentile. That's the 90th, that's the 10th, and all you have to do is just judge yourself. Well, first of all, if you pass, then you want to judge yourself against that 90th percentile, but just know that you're in the top 43% right away. If you're below here, well, then it becomes a question of how far below there are you, and probably more importantly, what are the reasons that you're that low. And I'm going to go ahead and write down probably the biggest reason. Time is probably the biggest reason you're down there. But for now, let's just interpret these results. So the solid line in this little blue box is your score in relation to the minimum passing score in the 90th percentile. So you can see where you land there. The range is a 90% confidence interval. And what that's saying is that, look, you've answered enough questions here that we're pretty certain that with 90% confidence that if you wrote this exam again and again and again, your score will end up somewhere in this range no matter what. That if you wrote another one under less ideal circumstances, that your guesses weren't as good, maybe they selected LOSs that you didn't really prepare for, etc., that if they did another exam that was maybe not right in your little sweet spot, that you might be at the lower end of this confidence interval. But if you wrote one that was a little more favorable to what you had learned, you'd be at the top end, but somewhere with 90% confidence, you'd be within that band. That's all that's telling you. And it's a fairly tight band. When you look at the sections, the overall is fairly tight. You've done quant. We get this. The smaller the sample size, the more uncertain we are about the true value of the population mean, which means we'd have wider confidence intervals, right? Larger standard errors. Well, we have a sample of 240 questions here, so we're going to have a much tighter confidence interval around your true score. So that's how you interpret the main score. Let's go down to the sections. The sections are a little bit different, and there is some extra information down here. So you'll have 10 titles along the bottom. I didn't put 10 here, but ethics, quant, economics, etc., etc. And you'll have the same type of information, except this this solid white line is now not a minimum passing score. It is a true 70%. That is a true 70% of the answers correct. It's not a percentile now. It's only 70% of the answers correct. The purple dotted line up here, this is still interpreted as the 90th percentile, and this red line down here is interpreted as the 10th percentile. But notice that they're different. They can be different for every single section. So what gives here? What this is telling you is that if this is 70%, look at the distance to the 90th percentile. And look at the distance down to the 10th percentile. Notice it's higher than some of the other sections, and notice this is higher than some of the other sections. This is saying equity as a section as a whole, the majority of people found it easy, because the 90th percentile is way up here, and the 10th percentile is getting closer to the 70% line. So if you have a section where the 10th percentile line is let's say it's here, it could be here, and the 90th percentile line could be way up here. That's saying that, look, 90% of the people who wrote this exam got over 70% if the 10th percentile line is here. In other words, that section was so easy. That's the result. So the closer the 10th percentile line is to the 70%, and the further away this is from the line, that is saying that overall of all the people who wrote, that tended to be an easier section altogether. Now look at this one over here. Look how close it is to the line. Look how far away this is from the 70%. That is saying that of everyone who wrote, it was a particularly difficult section. So you may end up with a situation where your box is up here like this, and there's your line, and all your other sections score above it, but you've scored well above the 90th percentile in that particular section, even if it may be your worst performing section. Compared to everyone else, you're still way in the top 10%. So you have to look at your performance versus 70%. Number one, that's important, because to get in the top 43% up here, you really want to strive to get over 70% in all the subjects. And it also tells you, I need work here, probably need a little bit of work here, need a little bit of work here, but this one's okay, this one's okay, this one is still in the safe zone because the 90% confidence interval doesn't include the 70%. So you know where you need work if you have to repeat. So again, that's your 90th percentile line. The closer it is to the 70%, it means the harder the section was for everyone. The further away it is, it means the easier it was for everyone. And then you have your performance in here as well, and you'll notice that the blue boxes will be wider here than they are here. What gives? Well, here you don't have enough questions. You have small samples. When you have small samples, what do you have? You have large standard errors, which means you're going to have wider confidence intervals, because remember, the standard error is the standard deviation divided by the square root of n. Well, square root of 240, or the square root of, well, if it's ethics, what do you get there? 36 questions. Which one will be bigger, right? So you'll have wider confidence intervals here. So this is saying that if you did it again, they're 90% sure that you'd end up in this range. So what you don't want is, you don't want your 90% confidence interval. Let's say that your score was here. You're above the 70, but your 90% confidence interval is below the 70. That's saying if you did it again, there's a good chance that you wouldn't make it. So you want to make sure that all of the lower parts of your confidence intervals are as far above the 70% line as possible. For those of you who passed, great. You can see where you are overall, and you can see what strengths you have, so that you know going into level 2, if let's say derivatives was your weakest and you were below that 70% line, you better pay more attention to that at level 2. You might want to do some review at level 1, but at level 2 it's giving you a hint that, hey, listen, it doesn't get easier, it just gets a little harder at level 2. So if this was your weak area, you're gonna have to pick it up. Now, what if you didn't make it? And you're looking at your results and you're wondering, well, how do I interpret these results? What do I do going forward? Well, number one is we're going to look at everything here below the line. This is where you're going to focus all your attention right now. Is I want you to look at the sections you have below that line. Let's not worry about what's above the line, because that's not broken. That doesn't need to be fixed. That only needs to be maintained. There's still a strategy. You can't just say, well, I'm good here, I can ignore that for the next one. No, you need to maintain it. It's down here something went wrong. And the more you have down here, the more something went wrong. The less time you gave yourself, yeah, you're probably going to have more items down there than otherwise. So this is where I think you have to be brutally honest with yourself. Did you give it your best shot? If you and you got to be honest, you can say, well, you know what, the night before the exam, if I could have bought myself another month, would I have done it? And if you would have said yes, that means you knew going into that exam that you really, really wish you had more time. But if the night before the exam you said, you know what, another month isn't going to change what I know now, and you went into the exam, then okay, something still went wrong. Maybe it was what you were paying attention to didn't seem to make a lot of sense. Maybe you were spending a lot of time memorizing formulas for learning objectives that didn't even have the word calculate in it. If a learning objective does not have the word calculate, you do not have to memorize the formula. And I do stress that in our reviews, when you do the reviews. We do some questions where we calculate things, but on the exam, if the learning objective does not have the word calculate, you don't have to memorize those formulas. So maybe you just spent a lot of time doing the wrong things or learning the wrong things. I don't know. But if you felt that, you know what, I knew a lot going in, maybe you just knew the wrong things going in. Well, what we're going to do is we're just going to pay attention to the sections that are light, and we're going to ask ourselves what went wrong there. It could be that, you know what, I ran out of time. I didn't have enough time for those sections. I knew that would happen. It could be, I really didn't get this section, so I just did the best I can, but I really skipped the hard work. I didn't have the time to really get into it. It could be sections where you just really didn't understand the content at all. Whatever the reason is, that's where you got to start paying attention to, especially for the big ones. Ethics, quant, FRA, economics is 10%, fixed income is 10%. Those are the big ones that you kind of want to say, well, okay, those are the ones I got to start getting above the line. Now, you may say, but quant is not my strength. FRA is not my strength. I didn't do well there, and it's not my strength. Well, it doesn't go away at level 2. This doesn't go away at level 2. It goes deeper. It gets a little bit more rigorous. It has more specialty topics. So it doesn't go away. So you got to get comfortable with it. Somehow you've got to get comfortable with it. And maybe just having it explained in a different way makes a lot of sense. Maybe when you go back to those learning objectives, you look at them and you say, okay, well, this one is just saying describe. And there's this big formula for kurtosis and skew. You do not have to memorize those. In fact, you can really just ignore those. All you really have to do is say, what does it mean? What does skew mean and what does kurtosis mean? And that's it. You're never going to have to memorize that formula, ever. Maybe you spent time memorizing that formula. And maybe you knew it going in and you said, not fair, not fair. They didn't ask me anything about this formula. Not fair. Well, it was fair. The learning objective did not say calculate. When it comes to those equations, it did not say calculate. Roughly about 25% of all the formulas in that book in level 1 are the only ones you need to memorize. Only the ones that are attached to calculate and interpret. So it's little things like that. Redoing the exam, paying attention to that and saying, I am going to learn to the learning objective. That's it. And once I know that learning objective, there's a reason why the learning objectives have those little boxes in front of them. When you read that list of learning objectives at the beginning of the reading, there'll be learning objective A, B, C, etc. So that you do this. I get it. I can explain it. I can calculate it. I can interpret it. I can discuss it. I can contrast it. That's it. That's your goal. That's it. So I hope that that gave you some light as to how to approach this again, how to interpret your results, and the strategy that you will use going forward. There's more strategy that you would use at this point. Your big decision at this point is, do I do it again, or do I just say, you know what, I'm done? And I would encourage you to really be honest with yourself. And if this is your missing variable right here, if time is your missing variable, well, that's not you. That's not on you. All you can blame yourself for is, well, okay, you know what? You underestimated the amount of work that needed to be done. You didn't give yourself enough time. But it's not like you can't do it. You just couldn't do it in the time you had. You can do it if you had more time. If that's you, then get back on that horse. Because, it'd be a shame just to let the calendar beat you as opposed to let the content beat you. Now, if the content does beat you, at least you can walk away from it saying, look, hey, I gave it my all. I really did give it my all, and I can now put it to sleep. I've done it, and, it's not for me, if you can get to that point. But just to half-heartedly try and then walk away saying, I tell you, you're going to look back years from now saying, well, really, I know I can do it. I know I could have done it. I just didn't give it a fair try. That's not fair to yourself. So you're going to do it again, and you're going to learn from your results, and you're going to pay attention to the sections where you really have to pick up those scores, and you're going to do it wisely. Studying with brute force strength, in other words, trying to memorize everything in that reading, is not efficient. You're going to look at those learning objectives. You're going to say, okay, LOSA tells me to contrast. Can I contrast these two concepts? If I can, move on. That's it. That's all you need to do. Even if there's formulas in that section and the learning objective says contrast, you're going to look at those formulas and say, you know what? I'm not going to be distracted with you. I'm not going to memorize you. I'm going to be aware of you, but that's it. All right. That's all I got.